Hey guys, it's KatieFrog217 here with a coloring tutorial of the sorts. I've been asked on and off how I do my coloring, and I thought I would make a video that explains how I do things, even though I'm not actually the best at explaining them. So I'm gonna have to ask you to bear with me while I try to do that. With that said, I realize this video is going to be very long, and I've provided a speed up version for those of you who just want to see the process condensed and don't want to sit through this really long video. And I've also provided that I figured out how annotations on YouTube work, have links to the parts of the video where I start a new part of the process so that you can always skip forward to that part at any time. That being said, let's start with the first part of my process. Step 1, base coloring. Okay, so one of the first things that I do when I start to color is I select my line art layer, which is typically a folder, and then I grab my selection wand and I start to select everything outside of the line art. It's typically super important that you have solid line art for this method, but you can always go in and select broken lines with the selection tool, but it takes a lot longer. So I suggest that you try to make sure that all of your line art is super solid for this. But I do this because for my coloring method, I will invert the selection layer once I'm happy, which you'll see me do here in like a few seconds. But this is one of the methods I've gathered from watching other people's speed arts. And this is a method I've been using for quite a while now, so most of the pictures that I've ever done use this method. But right at the moment, all I'm doing is I'm going around and selecting everything. But I didn't do it here, but before I start doing this, I typically make a layer right below the line art layer, which I will fill with a color once I'm happy with my selection. And that color is typically gray, but you can always change the color to whatever fits your needs, and you can always change the color later. So this is where I start do that. And then right above that layer that I fill this with gray, I put a folder layer, and then I clip that to the layer below, which is that gray layer, and then I start putting layers in there, and that's where all my coloring is going to go. So, and then with coloring, I typically start with what I perceive to be the lowermost layer, and that's typically the skin layers or the fur or whatever it's going to be. And then I start going up in order of what is going to be done. And you saw it there quickly, and you can see it in the background. Before I color, I typically make a base or a rough color. And that rough color is just for reference. But it's super helpful if you don't put your colors on the side. And it also helps me when I'm unsure of what's being colored. But here I also like to make my line art messy, my coloring messy, because it all is going to be below these layers, but it's because of the nature of my line art where you can slightly see through it. Typically I fix this by making that gray layer black, but I believe I neglect to do that, so it just helps it so you can it doesn't look like it shows through, especially it shows through more when I start coloring. I know it's like kind of a nitpick, but I'm kind of picky with my colors. And typically I do go in with this pen brush, but I do something here I don't normally do, which is I make the line art a selection source, and basically by doing that, if you change your bucket tool to selection source, it'll start filling in everything there like it's doing here. And again, I don't typically use this because the line art here, so I need to go through and I need to color everything under that line art. But so I'm just kind of doing his coat now. I did change it to lighter because it was harder to see against the darker gray. But and there's another thing that I typically do that I haven't done here. You'll see me do it later, is I make that background layer not white but gray so that you can see lighter colors against it, because I know I start doing it when I start coloring the chains. But you saw me go at the chains there real quickly. I was just checking to make sure that it was filled properly with a darker color. Because if you're unsure if anything's bleeding out or if you're missing anything, you feel that dark underlayer really dark, and you can see gaps. But yeah, I'm just checking my coloring right at the moment. And once you're done with every base color layer, lock that layer. You can lock the gray layer too. But I typically leave it unlocked just in case I need to go back and edit something on that gray layer. And right now I'm doing his dangly things. I can't remember what they're called. But I also do another thing here, and where I start coloring his belt red. It's on the same layer as his tassels. That's what they're called, because it's easier since the belt's gonna be a dark color. It's easier to see the red against the dark color. And I put it on the same layer as the tassels because they're not interacting with each other, so I am free to use that same layer again, so I don't have as many layers. And I'm just making that bottom layer darker because I'm gonna start doing the hair, which his hair is actually kind of dark. Or no, it's not. It's pretty light. And then I remembered here that I need to do the smaller details. I think you've noticed that I haven't done the mouth or the teeth or the eyes yet. Those are typically one of the last things I do. Here, this is where I make the background dark again, so that I can see what I'm doing. And then I didn't. What am I trying to say here? I didn't put a lot of effort into the chains because they don't connect to each other all that much. I just kind of made sure that everything was colored in and everything was fine. But yeah, typically a lot of the mini details are going to be on the same layer as long as they're not running into each other. And then I also like to keep a reference of the character on the side just in case I need it. Because it's easier for me to make corrections like I'm doing here. I noticed that he's missing like a zipper thing on his jacket, so I went back and I created another new line art layer because I like to be able to not have to worry about it running into each other. And then I was just fixing it. And I know what I do here is when I start coloring that zipper, I put it on with the jacket so that's not its own separate layer because it's easier to shade that since it's on that same object. It's easier to shade it there than it is to have it all by itself and have the shading look completely weird. Sometimes I do it depends on which character I'm doing and what kind of look I'm going for. But for this one, I just wanted to keep all of it kind of similar. I have no idea what I was doing there, but also with my pen tool here, the biggest tools you're going to see me using are the pen, the airbrush, and the blur tool. All those are on its normal settings. I will generally change the edge. Like on this one, it's a slightly softer edge, but that's because of the liner that I'm using. But you can see me going through with some of the liner again, making a new clipping layer because I was just checking again the edges, making sure everything's colored in. Because you can do this with black or white. It doesn't really matter. And then I think is when I start getting to, I was just checking all those, and then is when I start getting to the hair. So hair is, don't get me started on hair. Hair is kind of interesting. And what I want to mention about my line art is typically there's the line art for the body, and then the eyes plus the eyebrows plus whatever is related to the eye has its own layer. So I can do this where it can remove the eye and just work on the hair, especially if the hair is going to be in the way, because it's super annoying uh, to have to deal with the eye sometimes. But I'm just correcting the coloring, going in for the small details. This is where I get picky with my gray layer underneath there because of the edges that I put on the on hair. But also there's a little method I use. If you look right next to where your two colors are, there's a little checker box. If you click that, it pretty much makes whatever tool you're using is an eraser. And I like to use that when I'm doing coloring, so because the eraser is kind of slow. But um, another thing I want to mention, just because we're going over something that I've already talked about, um is my stabilizer. I typically keep my stabilizer at 2 or S7 depending on what I'm doing. And then I'm just putting the shading that's typically on his hair, and then I'm putting all my layers to make sure I have. Yep, this is where this is where I do the mouth. Typically, I'll do the mouth in two separate colors, but I decided to do it one solid color for easier shading here. And this is just a clip to the skin layer, and then I believe the eye and the teeth are on the same layer, so they're like the top base layer. Okay. And I think that finishes off base coloring. I'm just checking to make sure everything's done. Actually, no, I remember what I was doing. So I made a clip to the shirt layer, which is for his design, so that if I screw up, I'm not getting, don't have to go and color over it again. I can just adjust it by hand. And as you can see, I have it on the color underneath it, but I'm also using his references from the game to aid in my drawing here. But and then I'm just adjusting it with the skew. And then I'm going to be doing the squares that are on his jacket. This is another clip layer to his jacket layer, so that I don't have to, again, worry about screwing up or having to do, and I can fill these in with just the fill tool. And I do this with all the squares on his jacket. And I don't do it right away. I do it later in the tutorial where I merge those down onto his jacket. I should have actually done it earlier, but sometimes I just neglect to do things. And for those nice straight lines I'm doing on there, I have my pen tool set um, to its minimum size of 100, so it's just a solid line without any dips or anything. And then I'm just going over and erasing it, and I'm going to be doing the same for the lighter squares on his jacket, except I'll be turning the opacity down on those. Squares, by the way, are really annoying to draw sometimes. Depends on what you're going for, especially if you're going I know a lot of artists just make them straight on the jackets, but I wanted it to follow the curve of his shoulder. Yeah, just making some adjustments, putting on the other squares. Just adding some more for decoration. And I think that finishes up everything for face coloring. Step 2, shading. So by far this is going to be the longest part of the video, and I do apologize if you kind of get bored at some points. But when I start shading, specifically for this style that I'm doing, I always start with the skin layer, and I'm doing this shading layer right under the mouth and stuff, so I'm not doing over the layer. And so basically what I'm doing is I've taken that shading, that darker shading that was on the base color, and I'm putting it into this one because it's kind of just like a base preliminary shading. And I'll go in with the pen tool, but this is kind of more of a blur slash gradient layer. So my blur tool is set to have a hard edge because it just makes it easier for this type of picture to do it with. And sometimes I might not shade both sides. I might just shade one edge so that you have a hard edge and one so that the shading just goes down. And I'll do that typically with the fingers like you kind of just saw. But and then I'll have another layer like at the very top where I'll put all the colors that I'll use just in case I want to pick them up again. And I'm doing the darker shading now, which is pretty much the same with when it comes in terms of not using like block coloring or cell shading. And for this one, I think it was like a more gray red. And then you saw it there, but I do have a reference picture of a picture I did previously, if you've seen it on my Tumblr or my DeviantArt. So that I have a reference just kind of for how I want this to be colored. This is a much, much larger picture than that other one, but I thought I would have it on the side just in case. But, and then I've moved on. I think this is the third layer of shading, and it's generally just going to be more cell shading now, where I'm just kind of putting in block colors. Sometimes I will go in and shade it with the airbrush, or not the airbrush, but the blur tool. But I'm just kind of putting it where I want it to go to help define some of the edges. I can't really describe why I choose to place the shadows like I do. It's something that just kind of comes over time and just watching other people draw and just looking at their pictures. Because I'm no expert on shadows. There's probably anybody who's really good expert on shadows is probably like, oh, why did you put them there? But I'm still learning. So, but yeah, I'm just kind of tackling his hands. Hands, by the way, are the devil. I hate doing them. His collarbone. Sometimes I do go with an airbrush. I don't know if I do it here, but I'll go in with the airbrush and just at the edge I'll shade a different color so that that block color has its own gradient as well. Then going in with the mouth. I think this is just a base color on that strict layer that it was on. And then just kind of doing that. I think I used the airbrush there with a hard edge. Just to put in some darker color, and then I'm going in with the eyes. And typically with the eyes, I'll put a lighter color at the bottom, and then I'll shade darker gray at the top, and then I'll put in a black color shadow at the top too. But And then with on below those, I believe the shading layers, I put an overlay that's just kind of a yellow to help do highlights. And then above all those, I'm doing a highlight. If your colors seem a little off, like they're too dull or whatever, you can always use an overlay layer, which I know I will be using. But right at the moment, I'm just kind of doing the highlights. I'm not putting a lot. I'm putting them just kind of on the edges where I think they should go. Um, and sometimes you'll see me put them on shadows. Again, it's something I've picked up from other people. I can't explain why I do it all that well. And then I believe this is where I do the overlay. No, this is more shadowing because I prefer to have really dark shadows. In some of my pieces. But I don't want them to look black, so like dark black shadows. My style doesn't typically do that. Again, this is just kind of a normal pen. My pen and my airbrush again are just on strict uh normal settings, and then this is where I went in with the luminosity to brighten up, and then I'm doing an overlay to give him some more color to his skin tone, so he doesn't look like chalky, pasty gray. And then I was just kind of adjusting it because the eye looked pink. Going in with some more highlights. Then I was picking a layer to do next. I don't name any of my layers. If that drives you insane, you're more than welcome to do it. But I typically use a lot of layers. And then I'm doing the same pretty much for the jacket, getting in that green. Um, my m- my advice when you're doing green, even though I'm doing it here where it was with the multiply layer, it's going to be that same color that I used with preliminary shading. If you're going to do darker shadows, go more toward the blue green spectrum. I can't explain to you why that makes a better shadow, but it does. Um, because I know you'll see me do it later where I'll go into more blue green, but right at the moment I'm just kind of doing a green, more green color. If you keep seeing my pen go down, there are edits in here where I was doing other stuff, and I've pretty much mostly edited them out. There's maybe one or two instances where you'll see it, and then here you'll see me do it again where I'll put a shadow and then I'll erase it and I'll do that. Again, it's something I've picked up. And then I don't usually do this often, but I did select part of his jacket because the jacket does overlay some of it, and it's so much easier to do the shadowing if I don't have to worry about other parts of it, having to erase it, having them run into each other. So right at the moment, again, I'm just doing more shadowing. But typically I only try to do an inside edge for where the shadows are, but it really depends on the picture and how I do it that day. My style can be kind of inconsistent. This is where I select this because it's again, I don't want to all this color is just on the same layer, and I didn't want to have to worry about his coat in the back. I did get part of the pocket there, but I'm already addressing the pocket. Compared to my other pictures, this is probably a lot heavier shadowing than I normally do, but and then folds are always interesting. Whenever I do folds, I try not to do the outside edge where the fold isn't, because maybe a little bit, but I typically try to do where it's gone like folded down into itself, because that's where it's going to be a little bit darker. I took off the color layers, but what's nice about that folder is if you don't want to see any of the colors right away, you can just hide that folder and all the color is gone. And that's partly why I do it. So this is what I meant about the folds here. It's just kind of mostly doing that edge. I don't want to do it too heavily. Again, my blur tool is on its normal setting, but it's on a hard edge. Sometimes I don't know if I do it here, but I do swap it occasionally over to soft edge. I always feel like it blends better if you have it on a hard edge. I'm sorry if you can hear the phone. And then I'm going in, I think this is with my second shade layer. I'm not even sure. Nope, it's still the first. Hold on. Anyway, just got back from doing a phone call. So right at the moment I'm doing the arm. And again, I've used that selection technique. I've pretty much, I think I selected it from the line art layer with just the wand tool. But I'm just doing some of the shadows. It's it's kind of hard for me to continue to commentate on something that I know I've commented on because it's pretty much the same thing over and over. You'll see me do it over and over with this picture. Um, Pretty much the same process where I'll go in and I'll do those preliminary shading and then I'll go and do this and etc. So if I get repetitive, I apologize, but um, and then I'm going instead of a luminosity layer, I believe this is below the multiply layer, and this is just an overlay of like a yellow green, and it shows yellow green because yellow would have worked too, but the yellow green actually works a little bit better. And then I forgot I had to do his other sleeve, so I had to go back and do that. Sometimes I'll do the some of the highlighting before I need to. I'm kind of random with how I do my stuff. I was just putting down the highlight that I was using, I think. I could have done the selection for this too, but I think I'm just mostly using airbrush here with the blur tool. I don't use airbrush like a lot for what I do. It's just mainly for smaller details. And then I'm going in with the darker black shadow. And again, you can see here I've done more blue-green. And it creates a nicer shadow, I just believe, when you're doing greens. Because if you were just to stick to that green spectrum, it kind of, I don't know, looks too green. I'm not really sure how to do it, explain it. It's like you get more dynamic shadows if you mess around with what color you're using. So like for red, I might use a more of a purple or a magenta for its shadowing. Orange, I definitely use more red. Um, Yellow, I try to stick more toward orange for and brown depending on what I'm doing for its doing. Um, Purple gets more of a blue for shadowing and maybe like a lighter pink or a blue for a highlight. Again, it's something you kind of just pick up. I've watched a lot of people do speed arts and I pick up some of their stuff. Um, and then I could try to explain my shadow placement, but I can't. Pressman? I can't speak. But I really can't. It's just something I do. And then right there, I realized that that's actually supposed to be part of the hair. And then I was checking to make sure. And then I just went, screw it, leave it. And then went back to shadowing. You'll see me come back to the jacket more than once because I wanted to keep editing the shadows. And then I want to bring this up. I use a lot of layers. And I could merge them, but I like to have control later where if I want to adjust it because I wasn't happy with the shadow or something, I can make it darker, I can make it lighter, I can get rid of the layer entirely, and it won't screw up everything that I've just done. So. And typically here, I know for the jacket I have more than one cell shade layer. Um, and typically I stick with one or two. For this one, I believe there's two for the black shading just because there's a lot going on. But for now, right now, all these main shadows are on a single layer. Also, I don't use a lot of shortcuts. So it'd be a lot faster if I did, I'll be honest. But typically, the only shortcut I use is Control Z. But and this is one of the only times I think I've ever used a blur tool on well, not the only time, definitely I've done it before, where I've used the blur tool on what's supposed to be a shell shade layer, and I did that because I thought it looked nicer. Whether or not I still think that now is still up to debate. Looking back on this, there's other stuff I could have done, but I just kind of rolled with it. But just kind of going in, doing the shadows. I didn't do a lot of heavier shadows toward the back of the coat because one, I don't really know how to do shadows with a coat, and two, I was just didn't want to. I was gonna put a shadow there, but I decided since it's behind him, there'd be no sense for a shadow to be there. I think I darkened it a little bit, and I'm cleaning it up. This is where I did make another layer because I wanted to put this on that layer just to have that flap have its own. And then with the tassels, what I did was I drew it and then I put my airbrush, I clicked that checker box and I erased it so it looked like the shadow was lightening up as it went down. I did that for both tassels. I didn't do it closer on the where the tassel is closest to the jacket because I don't know. Again, it's something I pick up. And then of course I'm just doing the some of the highlights. And I'll be readjusting these highlights later once I'm all done inside with coloring, but going back to that layer, putting in some deeper shadows. Sometimes you'll just see a dot that I put for a highlight. It depends on really what I'm doing. I'll put more dots if I'm trying to go for a lot shinier look, but since this is fabric, I didn't want to overdo that. And then yeah, I didn't do a lot of highlighting on the. Well, I did a lot is kind of subjective. But I didn't do, in my opinion, I didn't do a lot of highlighting. I could have made the pen larger for highlights, but it would have made it more obvious. And typically I put my highlights on 4, but since this is such a large picture, I didn't want to overdo the highlighting. It would have overtaken like the lines. And for you, those of you wondering, I do go over and I do color the lines, and I'll explain that process when we get to it. But I think I'm just about done with the jacket. Also, I didn't change the color to red for his what I was doing it over these squares because I figured if I'm gonna stick with green, I'm gonna do green, and it didn't turn out too badly. So, plus I don't like to mix different shadowing colors. Okay, I think I'm gonna move on from the jacket. I think. Oh no, I was just doing some more lighting. Whenever you do lighting, I do luminosity with lighting. I also do it with overlay. Um, typically I won't put the final lighting layer above all the others. I'll probably put it under 2 or 3 shadow layers so it just doesn't take over the shadow. And then going in with the airbrush. I think it's another multiply layer. I can't really see it from when I'm looking at it. But just deepen the shadows again. I'll probably do this like a few times, and then just adjusting the shadows again. Okay, so now I've moved on to the shirt layer. Typically, I'd probably do the pants next, but for some reason, I have a habit of doing the shirt. And then with white is kind of a pain to color. And typically, what I'll do is I'll put it as a like a light gray, and then put white at the top, and then maybe a light, slightly darker color at the bottom. Um, again, it's just something I've picked up from other people. Sometimes I won't do it, sometimes I will. And then for this one, at first, what I'm doing is I'm just going in with a solid shadow. I don't have this layer on any kind of special thing, and then I've turned down the entire that gray layer so I can see underneath it because that's where my rough color is, and I'm just kind of following the shadows there. Yeah, at this point I have turned it to multiply. There's me using the blur tool. And for a lot of the times when I do shirts, I will do the blur on one side and just leave the other side have a harder edge so that you can see, so it defines the folds better. Ugh. Then just going over with an overlay because I didn't want it to just stay this gray color. Otherwise, it kind of looked, I don't know, too dull, I think is the word I'm looking for. And then with, whenever I'm doing shirts on white, it's typically a blue-gray, varying shades of blue-gray. And then with this, it was just the pen tool on the softest edge setting, and I was just doing that on a new layer for the hand. Doing some highlights. And then I think this was airbrush highlights with the hard edge, and then I went in with the blur tool. I save a lot, so because I don't. There's a chance I can always. My program doesn't usually crash, but there's just to be better safe than sorry, really. And then I did some darker shadows just at the end. I think I mostly did it with airbrush, but zoomed all the way out to see if I liked it. And then I think I was merging some layers there because if you see on the lower corner, it turned orange. It's just the string that my Sai is under is what I believe it to be, and I like it doesn't crash on me usually. I just want to make sure that that's not there for a long time because this is a pretty large picture, or in standards of my Sai, it's a large picture. I just kind of get paranoid. And then since we started on the chains, for the chains I decided not to do a lot of like airbrush or what's the word I'm looking for? Um Gradient shading because it would have made it look muddied because they are small chains. So I just went in with a pen and I just kind of drew in where the main shadows are. I do something with a little bit of blur and you'll see that later once I'm finishing up the chains. But yeah, with chains I don't draw or color often, so it's always an experiment whenever I color them. Come on, me. I don't know what you're doing. On some of the chains, I think you saw back there where I just did a little line to help define the edge of the chain. Then I remembered that there are other things on this layer that I should probably work on. And then the new multiply layer just to add some darker shadows. I did do a little bit of brush there, but just because I thought it was a little too dark. Then I'm doing a luminosity just on some of the edges of the chains. And then here is where I do something interesting. It's a multiply layer of just a really dark color. And then just to do highlights, I just kind of erase the edges. Because the chain is further behind him. I've never quite got this method down. I'm still trying to emulate a style I've seen. But I'll figure it out as I go. And then again, just to make it a little darker. And then just around the edges. Then I think I was working with the luminosity there, but. And then I'm doing highlights. I think it's just with a light blue that I used it with the chains. Metal's always kind of fun, the color. It can be a pain in the ass though. Adjusting the shadows. And then this is where I do some of the airbrush, and it's just to help define some of the edges of the chains. I don't think I do with all of them, just with some of them on their edges. Okay, and then I move on to this, and then for this, it was just on a layer above. It's just some highlights I'm doing with a lighter colors for their specific ones, and then darker ones for some of the shadows. And then I moved on to multiply for the main part just to do that. Belts are pretty quick. This is pretty much all I do with the belts when they're a dark color like this. And then for red again, I'm using more of a pink color for the shadowing. And I'm going in with the solid shadows. Red's one of those colors I always kind of struggle with. And then an orange kind of for just the highlights. Then I think I went in with a pinker color just because I was unhappy with how the color was. I was deleting layers and merging some. Checking my layers, make sure I got everything. Pants are always fun. So what I did with this is I made it darker at the top and lighter at the bottom just to give it a dynamic, gradient. And then I just kind of went in with the multiply and did some airbrushing, and then I started doing more of the solid shadows. Or in this case, the draw in solid shadows, then blur it. Pants have always been difficult for me to do. I think this is where I start doing more solid shadows. With pants, I typically avoid doing these huge shadows just because I know they'll stick out, because I'm not the best at shadowing pants. So I just kind of place them where I think they should go. A little bit of a highlight. Then doing some more of the highlights. This is pretty much my process for anything that's black. The base color typically is dark gray because it's easier to make it darker and lighter with a dark gray than if you went straight black. And then the hair. Oh, this is fun. Okay, so for this one, because his hair is kind of this strawberry-ish color in his coloring, I did more of a pink red color. And then with hair, I typically don't do a lot of shadowing with it because my style for hair hasn't really uh been set yet. So I'm just doing larger black shadows for the most part. I do one thing with a new marker tool that I have, and that I can show. That'll come up later. So because I'm always again experimenting with my shadowing style, especially with hair, because hair is kind of a pain. Just kind of doing black shadows. Sorry, I really don't know what to say. um, I guess my biggest what is it? What's the word I'm looking for? Advice with hair is not to overdo it all that much. Um, it's fine to have gaps like I have right there just to show the hair underneath because hair is dynamic. It's always moving. It's doing things. It's not like a completely solid entity. So, and then whenever you're doing hair, just to make sure you know where it is and how it's reacting to its surroundings. Yeah, and then this is where I decided to erase that, which I'm happy I did. So, and then of course I do that little shading technique with this one, just to help it look interesting and give it some depth. This is probably like one of the few parts of the hair I actually do that with, which is the weird part. So, just doing some adjusting. Come on, me, what you doing? There you go. As you can see, I'm kind of picky when it comes to hair. I believe for this one I have my pen on S7. It's so much easier to do curves when your pen is slower. Smaller shadows. As you see, I'm kind of all over the place when I'm doing shadowing. I don't just stick to one area, I kind of jump around. That strand of hair was really getting to me. Okay, so this is where I use that brush. You can clearly see the settings here, but I'm just doing it toward the top and mainly toward the middle where the curves are. The brush was made to do it from a top and the bottom, but I decided to do a little bit more dynamic with this one, and I was just adjusting the size of the brush to go with it. It's a brand new brush to me. I've only used it this is probably my second time using it. So, I'm just kind of playing around with it. But again, it's pretty much the same color I was using for those shadows. I believe I'm going to move that layer underneath that black shadow layer, and it's just the same color on a multiply. And this is just to give the hair some more dynamic looking looks. And then I've changed the color a little bit darker, and I did another multiple layer. And I did blur it there, but I believe I fixed that later, so. Because I didn't really want to do a lot of blurring with the hair. And these shadows aren't really as large as the other ones because they're just meant to be where they connect or um, just some darker areas of the hair so they're not as big, grand shadows. Doing a little airbrush at the top to make it darker. Then an overlay to adjust some of the coloring. And then I don't do a lot when it comes to highlighting the hair. Just kind of follow some of the edges of the hair. Not I don't know if I do it on every strand, but and then some of them don't get that long white line. They just get two little things. Then to get highlights. More hair adjustment. Woo! And then we're going back to, of course, the coat because the coat drives me insane. And then adjusting the teeth, which takes me 2 layers. And then the eyes. So basically with the eyes, what I do is I do a highlight on the top and then I shadow it heavily on the top. At the moment I'm doing a block shadow, but I do right there was a airbrush shadow. And then I do the highlighting, the eye glare, and then with this one I decided to do more around the edges so that he looked more insane. And then I just did some color adjustment with some of the shadows. And then again, back to the coat. But for the most part, I think that wraps up coloring. Just as soon as I finish up the coat. Step 3, line art coloring. Okay, so for line art, I typically, well, for here at the moment, what I like to do is I'm merging it and I'm just looking at all the colors underneath the line art because it's actually kind of neat to see what it looks like without the line art. But and then I'm just kind of doing a little bit more drawing here, and then I think I go in and edit something for the skin just to add it, give it a shadow. But because I'm all over the place when it comes to doing my stuff. Okay, so what I'm doing is over the layer I'm doing just kind of this dark brown. It'll work for, and I'm deleting a bunch of stuff right at the moment, but it'll work for the skin and the hair. I generally try to get something that is okay for both, unless the hair ends up being a dark color, which is fine. And I'm just kind of coloring that in where I think it should go. It's typically I just kind of bucket it and then airbrush it. Um, With the eyes have their own layer, and then I give it an airbrush. And what I do for that is, above that layer, I color the eyes, and with the eyes, I just color it the hair, and then I turn that opacity down so it looks like it's beneath the hair. And I generally put the hair below the main line art layer so it's not running into and looking just kind of looking weird. Um, that's what I do with the eyes. Most of the time, it depends on what I'm doing. And then I like to lighten up sometimes the edges. And generally, what I try to do is I try to make the line art look like it belongs, like it stands out, but at the same time, it belongs with all the highlighting and the coloring. And anytime I do a new color, like I'm focusing on the um, hair here, it gets a new layer. So the hair has its own layer, so I don't have to worry about, coloring something and accidentally running into it and then having to adjust it all over again. And this is mainly what I use my airbrush for. And then of course I'm going in with pen. Um, I did do adjusting later, and I cut that out of one of the other sections, so you'll see that kind of crop, just spliced in. And I'll point it out when we get to it, but uh, yeah, I'm just going in with a kind of a dark green right at the moment for the uh. Right there is where you saw, like, you can see it bleeding through. Again, I could just go through and make that gray layer black, but I neglected to do that. And then I'm just putting in background shadows, but I'm putting in a dark green that's slightly darker than the shadows, and then I'm putting in kind of a slightly lighter green. It's not like as as green as the lightest green on his jacket. It's just a slightly lighter green. Um, almost kind of like what his original uh base color was, and that just kind of gives it this highlight. Um, And then my general rule with hair or anything that touches a darker color is the liner kind of gets that darker color so it blends in with the background. So that it just doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. Again, this is all still on. I think this is it's actually its own layer. And then I go back to the jacket layer. Doing some more of the adjustment. And then, of course, with anything that's gray, it gets just this, or meant to be black, it gets just a straight black. And then it's a dark gray for the chains, and then I kind of airbrush white in and gray over top so that I just get the edges kind of a lighter color. And then the same with anything white. Generally lighter in the front, darker on the sides. I believe near his skin I make it kind of just white so it looks like it's just a shirt. I do go in and I scroll in and I make sure that wherever is touching the red is red. Yeah, like right here. Kind of just pick up whatever color was closest to it and draw that over the line art. You can see how messy that coloring is. But I don't do this with everything I do. Depends on the picture and what style I'm going with. This is just kind of my more fancier style, so I try to make it look like it belongs so that it doesn't just stick out. Doing the hair kind of irked me during this one. I wanted to make it darker, I wanted to make it lighter. And this is where I spliced in that extra part because I was doing this when I was going to do the background, and I didn't want that to be in the background piece because that was all about the background. So this is just kind of spliced in where I was doing some more adjusting, putting in some darker shadows on the edges for the hair. And generally, line art coloring doesn't take me too long. But, and then of course I was doing the same technique I did with the eyes with the eyebrows so that they don't stick out so much. At least I think I was doing that. I don't know. Step 4, background. Okay, so for the background, what I decided to do, I'm doing it like I did with my other picture, and that was because I have this canvas in inches. What I do is I make a new canvas, and then I change that to a 1 by 1 inch canvas. And I fill that in with a color and I copy and paste it. And then I color it in and I typically put a darker edge on one side and a lighter edge on the other to give that a glow. You can do this any way you want. And then this basically follows the basic principles of any kind of pixel art if you've done it. And so I just copy and paste. I moved it over so I could see better. And I copy and paste and I just start to make the shape of whatever I want. In this case, it's going to be a rainbow. You're not going to see the entire process for the background. I know, I'm sorry, but I was not going to spend 3 to 5 hours making this video, even longer by recording all that. You'll get to see it when I move on to uh, doing some more of the background. There, you'll be able to see it, but and then I was experimenting with doing slightly a highlight on that, but I decided not to. So, um, but yeah, in principle, all it takes is just you copy, you paste, you copy, you paste. So if you have a lot of layers, merge them now, like I did. Um, of course, you can always highlight chunks. I'll do that later. You'll see me do it. Um, but this can be painstaking. If you don't have the patience, don't do this. If you want to have a background like this, you're going to have to sit through it. And you see me working on the other colors. And then always, for the sake of this, I do believe I name what block is which, but that's also so I can keep it straight. So if I need that block color, I can have it right away without having to click through all of them and find it. But right there you saw just me doing something real quick. It was so fast I couldn't cut it out, so actually I could have, but what's the point? But yeah, so I start making my rainbow. I'm not the best at pixel art, so if my rainbow is wonky, because it is kind of on its side, I apologize. But I kind of wanted it to have this triangle shape anyway. Don't ask me why I chose rainbow. I just kind of picked a rainbow. Um, Actually, Pride Month is a good excuse for that too. Because when I was making this, there was a lot of people talking about Pride Month. So Pride, and just because Nagito is Nagito, and I decided a rainbow would be stupidly funny. Um, and I don't typically think about my backgrounds until the end, maybe halfway through drawing. I'm kind of horrible that way. If my biggest advice is if you're going to have a background, make sure you know what that background's going to be. Or if you figure out a background halfway through that you can work with what you've already got. Um, but I figured I was going to do a pixel art like this anyway for his background. I just needed to figure out what it was. Playing around with the reds. And if you delete anything after you merge your blocks, be very careful about how you take it off. Because if you even get a pixel off, you'll screw up your stuff. For this, I decided to do white background for doing the green because it was so much easier to see going up against the yellow. It seems kind of backwards, but I could have also made it black, but... And this is one time you'll actually see me do this that actually works out. I think it would have worked out with the blue if I did something else, but... Because the way I've colored them, they're always going to end up the same if I rotate them properly. I tried to do the same with the blue. It doesn't work out, but it was late at night. I wasn't going to mess with it as much. And you can see me here doing it 2 blocks at a time. Later on, I'll do 3, but I didn't record it. See, if I moved it slightly down, it probably would have worked out for me, but I was too tired. I didn't want to mess with it anymore. So I just decided to do it by hand. I know that seems backward. I was too tired, so I decided to do it the long way. Okay, so this is where it jumps over to doing the lines. This is when my computer just started up, so you'll have to ignore the pop-ups. But I did a line art layer. I made the lines completely straight. And basically, I'm just going to do this in the middle of all those color blocks. And just so they have a more defined edge, really. I was trying to do something there. I don't know what I did, but I was just like, too late to go back on it. So, I tried to do the same method where I copy and paste, like this with the horizontal lines, but it didn't work out, so I had to end up doing it one at a time. You'll see me do it. And if you see me scrolling back and forth really quickly, I'm just making sure that they're connecting to the edge. Um, it's painstaking. It takes a long time. Um, yeah, and so this is where I was going to do it, but as I kept going, I realized it wasn't sitting in the middle of those blocks. So I had to delete it and just did one line at a time, which is why it takes me so long to do some of these backgrounds. I could have left it alone, but I wanted to have these defined lines. And I just keep highlighting and I copy the closest one so I don't have to keep pulling everything down and then scrolling back up to do it. But I should be just about done with those. Because this is pretty much all I did with the background. You'll see me uh, work on lighting next. I just turn it on. I turn down the blocks. I did have some shadowing, yeah. I put that in or when I stopped recording by accident, so. Okay, next section. Step 5, little details and lighting. Okay, so I decided to do a little bit of overlay for the background just to lighten it up a little bit. That shadow behind Nagito, I want you to, for the moment, ignore it. It bugs me, and I had ended up changing it later after all was said and done. I had to record a little piece after this, and you will see it. But I decided to just have a little piece of Danganronpa pink blood on his face because I don't know, he's insane. Um, I would give more reasons why, but it's spoilers. But I think I made that a multiply. But basically, I think that was overlaid. No, I'm trying to figure out where this is going on. I think this is all the color of the blood is the same. Pretty much what I did is, and then I locked a layer. With the blood splatter effect, I actually have a few brushes that do it. But you can get an airbrush or you can get a type of brush tool and you can just change the effect to spread. And then or you can get an eraser tool and put the edge to hard and then put it on spread and you can get it that way too. But I did an overlay of pink and then I believe I do one of light blue. And then I make the edges darker with pink. And I was just checking with another one and put purple in there. But a lot of my last minute lighting actually ends up happening after I save the picture as a PNG, and you'll see that. But one of the other things I do is this streak of light, and basically what you can do is do what I do is I draw a straight white line, I put it on luminosity, I erase the middle, and then I blur it. And that'll give you kind of like a light streak. And then I always like to sign my work in a few different spots. I showed you 2 spots I put this in. I'm going to have more, but playing with the lighting on the jacket again, typical me. Okay, so I believe at this point I saved it as a PNG. I have a tendency to save it every time I change the coloring, and I like to adjust hue and saturation, and of course, luminosity not all the time, but contrast and stuff. So this was the basic coloring, and then I believe I saved this one as another one. But I'm going over with, I think it's another luminosity layer, and this one's just yellow, and I'm just doing some of the highlights. I'm going to do some more shadowing. But, yep, just putting in some highlights I think either got lost or I should have put in before. Especially with the chain, because I really wanted the chain to nicely stand out. any of the highlights on the tassels that I thought didn't look nice enough. I just have to be very careful when I'm doing this because you are pretty much essentially drawing over the picture, so you need to be careful not to run into your line art. And then for the darker shadows, I just kind of went in with a pink. Since all the overlay was with a pink, I decided just to roll with the pink. And it's mostly just playing with the hair again. I did do a little bit of the eye as well. But yeah, it's mostly going to be the hair. And I think the jacket as well. Because that jacket, man, I'm never happy with it. But yeah, I know some of you are probably unhappy that I skipped most of the background, but it's that little piece I showed you, pretty much all I did. Then I put my other tag up here. Step 6, photo re-editing. Okay, so this part's actually really short, but I figured out that earlier I didn't like how I had put the shadows. So what I did is I moved the shadow and I changed, you'll see me change the settings for the one before it, but basically I take the one that I had before and I put the new one above it. No, I put it below it and then make sure all the color settings match, and then I just airbrush what I don't want off the old picture. And that's basically how I do re-editing like that. If you've done a lot of editing on the picture, you're going to have to redraw in some of it. But since I didn't want to do that, I just did this. But this is the final picture. This is how it came out. I thank you guys for putting up with so much that I did. And I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this helps you out. Again, thank you for watching. Have a good day.